Hello, good evening. Well, within the last hour, Prince William has arrived at a charity dinner in central London.
How grateful are you for the public support you've received in recent weeks?
We really appreciate everyone's kind message. Thank you.
Well, the Prince of Wales is expected to make a speech at the London Air Ambulance event, of which he is a patron. The Prince of Wales returning to official royal duties earlier today for the first time since the announcement about the King's health. He took part in an investiture ceremony at Windsor Castle, carrying out the first of his royal duties since his wife, the Princess of Wales, went into hospital for treatment last month. Well, among those receiving awards today, former footballer and record goalscorer for the England women's national team, Ellen White, as she was awarded for services to association football. Well, we'll bring you what Prince William has to say a little later in the hour. But first, the Sky News investigation has exposed the culture of sexual harassment being faced by paramedics in the ambulance service. We've been speaking to workers who have described harrowing details of the toxic behaviour that they encounter often on a daily basis, which in some cases has turned into serious assault. Just to warn you that this report coming up from our correspondent Rachel Venables includes descriptions of self-harm, suicide and sexual attacks that many of you may find distressing.
It's exhausting coming to work, dealing with inappropriate behaviour and sexual comments.
I think they thought that because they were in a green uniform, they could get away with it, that they were untouchable.
They joined the ambulance service because they wanted to help people, but found a culture plagued by misogyny and sexual harassment. Freya says she put up with it for years, until one day a colleague locked her in the back of an ambulance and sexually assaulted her.
He just put his hand straight down my top. I was like, in shock. I couldn't move. I didn't know how to react. I just froze, absolutely froze. And if that wasn't enough, he then took my breast out and put my breast in his mouth. He took his pen, like a felt tip pen, and he drew a smiley face above and below my nipple. I just remember going into the station immediately when we got back, and I washed and scrubbed myself and got rid of the ink. And he took a photo of it as well.
The trauma led Freya to try to amputate her breast and attempt to take her own life. She's received compensation from the trust and no longer works as a paramedic.
I have scars, mentally and physically, and I had the career I so loved stolen from me. And I'm lonely. I'm on my own because I can't trust anyone.
So this was the paramedic epaulets that I had when I first was a paramedic, which I was really proud of. And this is my epaulets from when I was the operations manager.
Carol King was in charge of 130 members of staff in the southwest of England, but she left after raising complaints about harassment and bullying that she says went unresolved.
You're always afraid of saying anything to anybody who is more senior because you always think you're going to get reprisals, possibly that you won't get another job, you won't be able to move up the career ladder. That's the biggest thing. I don't think that's how I always felt years ago, but I still think that happens now.
If a young woman came to you today and said, I'd like to be a paramedic, I'd like to join the ambulance service, what would you say to her?
Don't do it. Don't do it.
Why?
Well, if I had a daughter, I wouldn't let them. I just think there's too many predators in there waiting for some young girl to go in there.
South Western Ambulance Service says it doesn't tolerate behaviour that goes against its values and encourages victims to speak up. And in recent years, women have been sharing their stories. The College of Paramedics launched an investigation and support programme after hearing from students about the sexual harassment they suffered while on placements.
We have found that our female student council members are experiencing misogyny and sexual harassment, if not on a daily, on a weekly basis, by a minority of people who just feel that behaviour is acceptable.
Tracy Nichols is particularly concerned about students feeling pressured into relationships or even sexual acts in order to progress.
Sometimes it's perceived as banter, but immediately there's a power imbalance there for that student. And sometimes that progresses to a really difficult space where I won't sign you off until maybe you come out for a date with me, or I won't sign you off until you send me a picture of yourself.
Laura is a newly qualified paramedic and says it's common for older male mentors to begin relationships with much younger students.
Very often the stories I've heard of mentors who have wives and kids at home are almost preying on these students who don't think they know any better. And the student goes into it and sort of thinks, you know, this is a person who's got respect. They look up to these paramedics. And the mentor will play on that and will take advantage of the power that they have.
She says female paramedics are forced to put up with sexualising comments disguised as banter.
It's awful. I actually look forward to the winter months where it's colder, where I can wear my jacket more often so that I'm more covered up. We've got the same uniform, you know, we've got a standardised unisex uniform, and I shouldn't have to feel like I'm being objectified and looked up and down by my colleagues, but that is the case.
An NHS spokesperson said any form of sexual misconduct is completely unacceptable, and that every ambulance trust in England has committed to a plan which commits to improving sexual safety. A number of culture reports in recent years have highlighted the open secret of sexual harassment, blaming the male-dominated nature of such a hierarchical work structure. But victims want that secret to now be fully understood and finally dealt with. Rachel Venables, Sky News.
Oh, so much of that hard to listen to. If you or anyone you know has been affected by the issues in Rachel's story there, you can call the Samaritans on 116 123 or email joe@samaritans.org. Well, Sky News has shown this problem of sexual harassment in the ambulance service appears to be widespread. I'm joined in the studio now by Dr. Becky Cox, a GP and founder of Surviving in Scrubs. And Becky, we were just watching Rachel Venables' report there together, and it comes as no surprise to you because you've lived this. Absolutely. What was your experience?
So I'm a GP, I'm a doctor. My experience was that of, you know, the banter, the sexist, inappropriate comments, and unfortunately it escalated up to sexual harassment and sexual assault, and that was what experiences both as a medical student but also as a junior doctor as well. So this is something I've lived through. Mm-hmm. It's something so many survivors come and tell us that they're going through. And so, yeah, unfortunately, it's not a surprise, but it still gets to you every time I hear it.
No, I can tell in your voice, and we're not talking about a one-off incident here. We're talking about a culture. It's followed you from being a medical student with big dreams of going into this profession to help people, to make people better, to make the world a better place, as romantic as that sounds. But of course, that's how you start off as a medical student. But it followed you through. Did you have anywhere to turn at the time? As a young woman coming up in the medical profession, you probably don't understand just how toxic it is in the beginning.
No, absolutely. In the beginning, you go in very naive. It's all, you know, new experience to you, and you think, I've just got to, you know, do my job, learn, progress, pass my exams, all of that sort of stuff. And so when these incidents start cropping up, you think, oh, it's okay, it's just something small, I can ignore it, I can carry on, keep my head up, keep going. And it builds and it builds and it builds. And it absolutely follows you through. It's something that's there right from the very beginning of medical school. And
anywhere to turn
all the way through
within the NHS? Any HR, mentors, senior figures, any structure in place for anything like this? You know, I don't know whether it's changed, but particularly during your time, was there any sort of safe haven for you to say what was going on?
Well, I was going through it about 10 years ago, and I felt I could not speak up. I felt that it was too risky to do that. It was shameful, it was embarrassing. I was worried about my career, and I just didn't feel safe doing that, and I felt that I wouldn't be listened to if I did, so I didn't at the time.
But you did, and what you went on to do is you went to found Surviving in Scrubs, which was designed as a website originally for people to share their stories, because you knew through talking to other female colleagues that you're not alone in this, it's just not being spoken about. What happened as a result of setting up Surviving in Scrubs? What did you uncover?
Well, we set it up in June 2022, and we set it up as a space where people could share their story anonymously, and that's for all across healthcare, not just doctors, everyone. And instantly we had a flood of stories coming through to us, and to this day we've got more than 200 stories detailing wide-ranging maternity discrimination, sexist discrimination, sexual harassment, sexual abuse and rape, and that goes all across healthcare. No area of healthcare is unscathed from this, and it shows the sheer scale of the problem that we're facing.
Yeah, the scale of the problem and the degrees of horror involved. I mean, misogynistic comments, all the way through to sexual assault and rape. What has been the reaction of the NHS? Because, you know, we both looked at that statement that was on screen during Rachel Venable's report there. How cooperative are they now that this is being spoken about more? It's not all out there in the open, of course it's not.
No.
It's those brave women and some men as well coming forward to tell their stories. What are the next steps?
Yeah. So I think within the NHS, there are parts of the NHS that are listening, and there have been, within NHS England, working groups set up to deal with this. But I think one of the issues that we see is that this doesn't necessarily trickle down to the hospitals, to the trusts, to the employers who are actually responsible for the perpetrators and holding them to account. But also we haven't seen it at government level coming through. We've tried to raise again and again with the Department for Health and Social Care, and we've had very little response from them. So yes, there's a part of the NHS that is working on this, but we feel there's top and bottom, it's not there at the moment.
What happened with your story? Was the man responsible for assaulting you ever held to account? What happened there? Where did you take it? How does it sit with you now?
Well, unfortunately, I had multiple experiences, so there are more than one perpetrator, actually. Many of them I didn't raise at all, and I still, to this day, have not raised because I have not felt able to.
So they're still working within
Yes.
the National Health Service?
As far as I know, yes, they are.
Okay.
One I've tried to raise a concern about, but again, hit many, many barriers that I've really struggled to get through in reporting.
This is something we hear about so often when there is a large organisation or industry. It's an abuse of power, and the abuse of power comes from the people who hold the power. Are they being protected? Is that what you feel like? It's colleagues higher up the chain protecting that colleague. It's the institution or the organisation protecting that person as well.
Yeah, so in November last year, we analysed the stories on our website, and one of the themes that came out was a culture of protection amongst staff. And these are known perpetrators, repeat offenders who are, you know, well exist within the healthcare. People know who they are, and yet they're not held to account. It's ignored, it's carried on. They're valuable to the NHS because they're providing a consultant clinical service. So how can we sack him? How can we hold him to account? Because he's valuable to us.
How does that make you feel? You're valuable.
I know, it makes you feel like you're not valued, though, at the time. It really does. And it does, as a woman, you feel that you are not of the same value as the men working in those instances.
And presumably the women that come to you to share their stories feel exactly the same.
Yeah.
Are many of them not working in the NHS anymore because of what's happened to them?
Yeah, so we've got many who've gone off on long-term sick leave because of their experiences, diagnosed with depression, anxiety, PTSD. We've had some who've had to quit, relocate across the country because the perpetrator kept his job, she couldn't keep her job. And yes, we've had people leave the NHS altogether.
The NHS is, you know, held up in such high esteem. We know it has its problems and its issues, but this is an environment where the people that work within it are there to protect and safeguard people, to look after people.
Yeah.
And people watching at home will be thinking, there are predators in the NHS, you know, predatory to their colleagues. But what does that say for patient safety as well? You know, these must be some difficult questions that you've wrestled with over your years in the NHS, is if, you know, this is being carried out against members of staff, how can patients feel safe? I don't want to be alarmist, but that's immediately what I thought when I watched Rachel's report this morning.
Well, I think exactly. If you've got a man with these beliefs who's working within healthcare, we do not know if they are extending those beliefs towards women patients. Are they dismissing their pain? Are they not taking their presentation seriously?
As a patient, you're vulnerable. If you feel like this is being carried out by a doctor or a man in a position of authority, you're at your most vulnerable. You probably wouldn't speak out either.
No, exactly. I think as a patient, it's even harder to go through this kind of experience and know what to do, who to turn to, and how to cope with that. And yeah, I think there are some missing dots that have not put together in terms of who these perpetrators are impacting, because my suspicion is that this isn't just staff. They are probably targeting patients too.
Becky, final question. What do you want to happen next? What's the step in tackling this? Because we're uncovering the problem. what can be done? What do you want to be seen to be done by the NHS and the government?
So we've got multiple asks of the NHS, a big wish list. Amongst that is sexual misconduct policies in every trust. They do not exist at the moment. Minority
That's
have them.
jaw-dropping, yeah.
We need to see perpetrators actually being held to account by both the healthcare regulators and their employers, and we need to see education and training for staff to know what are appropriate behaviours, which sounds ridiculous, but actually we do need that in place.
Yeah. Oh, Dr. Cox, thank you so much for coming in to talk to us about your experience and the work you're doing to help others. Dr. Becky Cox there, we really appreciate it, and we'll speak again, I'm sure. Thank you.
Thank you.
Still to come on the UK Tonight, the family of Brianna Ghey. They've been invited to meet the Prime Minister. This is after he was criticised for making a transgender jibe in the House of Commons earlier today. Plus, the call for ministers to compensate patients whose lives have been impacted by some of the country's worst medical scandals.
A lot of action going on. I'm Alex Crawford and I'm Sky's special correspondent based in Istanbul.
This is what makes the job so fantastic.
Body knows someone affected by COVID.
Change seems tantalisingly close in this corner of the UK.
This is my patch, my specialism. It's also my home.
We're just going to go to the US Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, now, who's speaking in Tel Aviv. Let's listen in.
To bring all of the remaining hostages home. I've met with families of the hostages multiple times during prior visits, as well as in Washington, and I expect to see them again tomorrow. The sheer agony, not knowing the fate of your loved one, it's almost unimaginable. And I know that that pain is almost unbearable. So we have been intensely focused from day one on getting the hostages, all the hostages, back with their families where they belong. And we will keep that focus until we get them back. We had an opportunity today to discuss with the Israeli government the response that Hamas sent last night to the proposal that the United States, Qatar, and Egypt had put together to bring the remaining hostages home and extend the humanitarian pause. What I can tell you about these discussions is that while there are some clear non-starters in Hamas's response, we do think it creates space for agreement to be reached. And we will work at that relentlessly until we get there. We had extensive discussions with the Prime Minister and national security leaders on the status of the military campaign to defeat Hamas and on the progress toward achieving the fundamental objective of ensuring that October 7th never happens again. At the same time, we're continuing to work closely with Israel and Lebanon on diplomatic efforts to de-escalate tensions on Israel's northern border so that families can return to their homes, both in northern Israel and in southern Lebanon, and live in peace and security. We also discussed the imperative of maximizing civilian protection and humanitarian aid to address the ongoing suffering of Palestinian civilians in Gaza. Nearly 2 million people have been displaced from their homes. Hundreds of thousands are experiencing acute hunger. Most have lost someone that they love. And day after day, more people are killed. On all of my previous visits here, and pretty much every day in between, we have pressed Israel in concrete ways to strengthen civilian protection, to get more assistance to those who need it. And over the past 4 months, Israel has taken important steps to do just that, starting the flow of aid, doubling it during the first pause for hostage releases, opening the north and south corridors in Gaza so that people could move out of immediate harm's way through these corridors with 4 hours pause every day, 3 hours notice. Opening Kerem Shalom, starting the flow of assistance from Jordan, establishing deconfliction mechanisms for humanitarian sites. As a result, today, more assistance than ever is moving into Gaza from more places than at any time since October 7th. As the largest donor of humanitarian aid to the Palestinians, the United States has helped provide much of that assistance, including funding 90,000 metric tons of flour delivered from Ashdod port. That's enough to provide bread for 1.4 million people for the next 5 months. A UN team began its mission to the north to assess conditions for the civilians who are still there, as well as what needs to be done to allow displaced Palestinians to return back home to the north. And yet, as I said to the Prime Minister and to other Israeli officials today, the daily toll that its military operations continue to take on innocent civilians remains too high. In our discussions today, I highlighted some key steps that Israel should take to ensure that more aid reaches more people in Gaza. Israel should open Erez so that assistance can flow to northern Gaza, where, as I said, hundreds of thousands of people are struggling to survive under dire conditions. It should expedite the flow of humanitarian assistance from Jordan. It should strengthen deconfliction and improve coordination with the humanitarian providers. And Israel must ensure that the delivery of life-saving assistance to Gaza is not blocked for any reason by anyone. We urge Israel to do more to help civilians, knowing full well that it faces an enemy that would never hold itself to those standards, an enemy that cynically embeds itself among men, women, and children, and fires rockets from hospitals, from schools, from mosques, from residential buildings, an enemy whose leaders surround themselves with hostages, an enemy that has declared publicly its goal to kill as many innocent civilians as it can simply because they're Jews, and to wipe Israel off the map. That's why we've made clear that Israel is fully justified in confronting Hamas and other terrorist organizations. And that's why the United States has done more than any other country to support Israel's right to ensure that October 7th never happens again. Israelis were dehumanized in the most horrific way on October 7th. The hostages have been dehumanized every day since. But that cannot be a license to dehumanize others. The overwhelming majority of people in Gaza had nothing to do with the attacks of October 7th. And the families in Gaza whose survival depends on deliveries of aid from Israel are just like our families. Their mothers and fathers, sons and daughters, want to earn a decent living, send their kids to school, have a normal life. That's who they are. That's what they want. And we must not lose sight of that. We must not lose sight of our common humanity. We remain determined as well to pursue a diplomatic path to a just and lasting peace and security for all in the region, and notably for Israel. And that diplomatic path continues to come into ever sharper focus as I travel throughout the region and talk to all of our friends and partners. An Israel that's fully integrated into the region, with normal relations with key countries, including Saudi Arabia, with firm guarantees for its security, alongside a concrete, time-bound, irreversible path to a Palestinian state living side by side in peace and security with Israel, with the necessary security assurances. Over the course of this trip, we discussed both the substance and sequence of steps that all would need to take to make this path real. That includes steps by the Palestinian Authority to reform and revitalize itself. And I reaffirmed the imperative of those steps in my meeting today with President Abbas. Chief among them, improving governance, increasing accountability to the Palestinian people, reforms that the Palestinian Authority is committed to make in a recently announced reform package, and that we urge it to implement swiftly. Now, we can see so many of the actors in the region lining up to move down the path that I just described. But some are not. Some are trying to sabotage that path. Iran and its proxies continue to escalate and expand the cycle of violence that we all want to break. We'll continue to defend our people. We'll continue to defend our interests in the face of such attacks, not to fuel escalation, but to prevent it. Finally, in my discussions today with the Prime Minister and senior officials, I also raised our profound concerns about actions and rhetoric, including from government officials, that inflame tensions, that undercut international support, and place greater strains on Israel's security. The people of Israel have sacrificed enormously to forge this nation and to defend it. They'll ultimately decide the right path to take and whether they're ready to make difficult choices necessary to realize the vision of the long, elusive prospect of true peace and true security. As a true friend of Israel, as the country that has always been first to its side, whether that was May 14th, 1948, or October 7th, 2023, we will always offer our best advice on the choices before this country, especially the ones that matter the most. Thank you. Happy to take some questions.
The first question goes to Zolan Kano-Youngs with the New York Times.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary, for the question. Just have a couple for you here. I know that you said there's still room for agreement in terms of the negotiations over the release of hostages, but the Prime Minister, after you spoke with him, pretty bluntly dismissed Hamas's response, describing it even as ludicrous. I just want to clarify, is this response or these negotiations DOA at this point? And what specifically did the Prime Minister object to in that response? Also, the Prime Minister, shortly after you met with him, made clear that Israeli troops will be moving deeper into Rafah. Will the United States simply stand by as this action is pursued, even with 1 million Palestinians, more than 1 million Palestinians being held are in Rafah, seemingly with nowhere to go? And if I may, Congress is now moving ahead with a bill that would pair aid for Ukraine with aid for Israel. Would the administration endorse any potential package that once again prohibits UNRWA funding? Thank you.
That's impressive. Now, I'm taking it that that includes the questions of all of your colleagues as well. Is that right?
I don't think so. Couldn't do that to them.
All right. Starting with the first part. Look, as I said, we've looked very carefully at what came back from Hamas, and there are clearly non-starters in what it's put forward. But we also see space in what came back to pursue negotiations to see if we can get to an agreement. And that's what we intend to do. And I'm not going to speak for Israel or anyone else involved, but again, we believe the space is there, and we believe that we should pursue it. With regard to Rafah, look, as I said before, Israel has the responsibility, has the obligation to do everything possible to ensure that civilians are protected and that they get the assistance they need in the course of this conflict. Any military campaign, military operation that Israel undertakes needs to put civilians first and foremost in mind. And I suggested, again, some ways to do that. And that's especially true in the case of Rafah, where there are somewhere between 1.2 and 1.4 million people, many of them displaced from other parts of Gaza. So we want to make sure, again, that in anything that's done, in any military operations, the situation for civilians is first and foremost in mind, and that the necessary steps are taken to make sure that they're protected and they have the assistance they need.
You suggested some ways to do that.
Well, I just went through a number of things that we urge Israel to do now on the building on what it's already done in terms of both humanitarian assistance and civilian protection. And as I said, in the case of Rafah itself, that's extremely important because it has such a dense population, including many people who've been displaced from other parts of Gaza. And on UNRWA, look, we were deeply concerned by the allegations that were made about the participation or involvement of some of its employees in October 7th. And it's imperative that, as the UN has said it's doing, that there be a thorough investigation, that there be clear accountability, and that there be clear measures put in place to make sure that this can't happen again, that personnel working for it were not in any way involved in terrorism or the events of October 7th. We know that the work that UNRWA performs, the functions that it performs, have to be preserved because so many lives are depending on it. And so going forward, we're going to look to the actions that are taken. And as I said, it's imperative that the functions be preserved.
It sounds like the administration then would potentially support an aid package that still prohibited funding for UNRWA.
I'm not going to get ahead of our views on hypothetical pieces of legislation.
Although there was already an aid package that the administration endorsed that prohibited that funding.
I'll leave that to the next time. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary.
For the next question, Gil Tamery with Channel 13.
Mr. Secretary, thank you for the opportunity. Gil Tamari, Channel 13. It seems to be that the entire Biden doctrine vis-à-vis Israel, a future Palestinian state, and normalization with Saudi Arabia is collapsing. Netanyahu says no with capital N to any form of a Palestinian state. Saudi Arabia says a normalization with Israel will only be considered after an independent Palestinian state is formed in the 1967 borders, which is Jerusalem as its capital. So how does the U.S. intend to break this deadlock? And secondly, regarding the hostage deal, after we listen tonight to Prime Minister Netanyahu that says that Hamas's demands are delusional, how do you find the space, as you mentioned, for negotiation? And do you feel that Netanyahu is exhausting every possible option to bring back the Israeli citizens kidnapped and held hostage by Hamas? Or again, Israeli politics is intervening? And lastly, why did you cancel your visit tomorrow to Kerem Shalom?
So this is good. I think we have a trend going of at least 3 questions per question. Last question first. There was no planned visit to Kerem Shalom, so there was nothing to cancel. One of the things we want to make sure, as well, as I said, is that assistance be able to move smoothly and sustainably, but there was nothing to cancel. Second, I guess I'll go in reverse order. On the hostage agreement, again, I can only repeat myself. Clearly, there are things that Hamas sent back that are absolute non-starters, and I assume that's what the Prime Minister was referring to, but I don't want to speak for him. But at the same time, we see in what was sent back space to continue to pursue an agreement, and these things are always negotiations. It's not flipping a light switch. It's not yes or no. There's invariably back and forth, and as I said, we see the space for that. And given the imperative given the importance that we all attach to bringing the hostages home, we're intent on pursuing it. Finally, as I've said before, we were, before October 7th, pursuing the possibility of normalization between Israel and Saudi Arabia. And in fact, I was scheduled to come to Israel and to Saudi Arabia, I believe it was on October 10th, to pursue that, and in particular, to focus on what we already knew back then was a necessary Palestinian component to any normalization agreement. When I saw the Crown Prince in Saudi Arabia just a couple of days ago, he repeated to me his desire and determination to pursue normalization. But he also repeated that in order to do that, two things need to happen. One, there needs to be calm in Gaza. Two, there needs to be a clear and credible pathway to a Palestinian state. So, as I said before, you can see the path forward for Israel and for the entire region with integration, with normalization, with security assurances, with the pathway to a Palestinian state that entirely changes the equation and the future for the better, for Israelis, for Arabs, for Palestinians. And in so doing, isolates groups like Hamas, isolates countries like Iran that want a very different future. But as I also said, going down that path, pursuing it requires hard decisions. None of this is easy. And so it will be up to Israelis to decide what they want to do, when they want to do it, how they want to do it. No one's going to make those decisions for them. All that we can do is to show what the possibilities are, what the options are, what the future could be, and compare it to the alternative. And the alternative right now looks like an endless cycle of violence and destruction and despair. We know where the better path lies, but I don't minimize in any way the very difficult decisions that would need to be made by all concerned to travel down that path.
Anton LaGuardia with The Economist.
Thank you very much, Secretary. Can you, you've used some very specific words in describing this vision for a better path. What do you actually mean by clear, credible, irreversible, time-bound path to a Palestinian state? And in Qatar, and again today, you spoke about Israel receiving security guarantees and assurances from its neighbors. What does that actually mean? What's on the table for Israel if it goes down this path? And would that include additional US assurances to Israel on top of the arrangements that currently exist? Thank you.
Look, I'm not going to get ahead of things or get into specifics. I think those words speak for themselves. How they're defined, how they're made real, that's the subject of diplomacy. It's very much the subject of the conversations that I've been having in the region, as well as here, as we flesh that out and give real substance to it. But I don't want to get ahead of it. What I can only add in response to the rest of your question is, it's clear to me from talking to many of the countries in the region that they're prepared to do things with and for Israel that they were never prepared to do in the past, including steps that would further address any security concerns it might have. And similarly, the United States is prepared to do that too. But the details of that, the substance of that, these are all things that we continue to talk about in these conversations, in our diplomacy, and we'll bring it into ever sharper focus. Because at some point, yes, it will be very important to put forward exactly those details and see if, for all parties concerned, there is a credible pathway to walk down. And again, I believe that there is, but there remains a lot of work to be done in the weeks and months ahead.
The final question goes to Mohammed Jamjoon with Al Jazeera English.
Mr. Secretary, thank you. I have two issues I want to ask you about. The first is regarding the fact that you've spoken about the importance of creating a pathway for a Palestinian state. There have been reports that you've asked the State Department to review options on potentially recognizing a Palestinian state. So I want to ask you if that's the case, and if so, is that a type of pressure point that you feel is needed to get Israel to agree to a ceasefire and one that could ultimately lead to a two-state solution? That's the first issue. Second issue I want to ask you about is the fact that Israel has maintained that Hamas needs to be eliminated, that it cannot have any role in governing Gaza after the war has ended. Where does the U.S. currently stand on this? Is it in any way acceptable to the U.S. for Hamas to be playing a role in governing Gaza in a day-after scenario? And what would U.S. policy be toward Hamas going forward?
The short answer to the second part of the question is no. As to the first part of the question, look, as I just said, there are a number, as we're defining the path forward, including the pathway to a Palestinian state, there are a number of policy options that people may propose as part of that process. But our focus today is on all of the diplomacy needed to bring it about, including, again, getting ideas, getting proposals from all concerned, and putting those together in a credible and clear plan. So that's where we are. And as I said, we'll continue to have these conversations, to engage in that diplomacy, to really sharpen the focus on all of the different elements that would be necessary, that would be involved, and that each of the parties believes is important. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone, and apologies for keeping folks late. Hope you get a chance to have some dinner. Thanks.
Well, I'll take that as an apology for interrupting the UK tonight for some international news. That's the US Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, there. We did, of course, hear from the Prime Minister, the Israeli Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, earlier today here on Sky News as well. Let's just bring in our US correspondent, Mark Stone, who was watching that along with us. Mark, what did we get that was new from the US Secretary of State?
A clear indication that the wheels have come off the latest attempt to broker a ceasefire, or at the very least a pause in fighting. Antony Blinken is in the region and has spent the past few days crisscrossing the region into different capitals, coming up with what he hoped he would be able to announce at the end of this week, which would be a perhaps 45-day pause in the fighting in Gaza, which would allow for hostages to be released and aid to get into that devastating strip of land. But it was clear a couple of hours ago when Benjamin Netanyahu, the Israeli Prime Minister, gave his news conference in Jerusalem that there was a gulf between the American position and the Israeli position. He effectively said that there is not a chance of a deal with Hamas, that there was no chance of a stopping of fighting, and he even went as far as to suggest that his forces would be moving into Rafah, that is the southern city in Gaza, where there are perhaps 1.6 million people displaced in that area. Now, compare that with what the Americans are trying to achieve. It was clear from the tone of what we heard from Antony Blinken that there is a real difference. He said, we look carefully at what Hamas has said. There are clearly non-starters, but there was also space to move forward. Well, on the face of it, the Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu sees no space to move forward. So this is a remarkable gulf between two apparently such close allies. And I was struck that the tone of Netanyahu was incredibly undiplomatic towards America, and it was pretty downbeat, the tone of Antony Blinken there. Talk too of a Palestinian state. The Americans are now quite clear that a Palestinian state should be at the beginning of any path to peace. The Israelis, Netanyahu at least, saying not a chance.
Mark Stone, thank you. More on this coming up following us at 9 o'clock with The World with Yalda Hakim. Now, Sarah de Lagarde lost her right arm and leg when she was hit by 2 tube trains after slipping on a wet platform. You'll remember Sarah's story. She spoke to us in November last year, telling us about how the accident changed her life forever. Well, now she's calling on the Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, to meet her to discuss how to improve safety measures And she's bringing legal action against Transport for London, who she says hasn't accepted moral or legal responsibility for what happened.
I am calling on Sadiq Khan again to meet me and other victims of the London Transport Network to discuss these issues urgently before anyone else gets hurt or killed in this way. We need there to be an independent and comprehensive review of TfL's safety procedures so that meaningful lessons can be learned.
Well, Sarah is with me in the studio now. Sarah, welcome back. As always, good to see you. It didn't have to come to this, did it? You didn't really want to take legal action. What got you to this point today?
Do you know, I mean, the accident happened over a year and a few months ago. And over that time, I've been trying to engage with TfL. I've been trying to have a conversation about what happened in terms of mapping out the learnings, because acceptance of failures leads to innovation. That's the point. Mm-hmm. And the fact that I have had no response, no engagement, no apology, and now a formal denying of liability, of responsibility, for me, that leaves me no other option than to say, OK, what else can I do? And legal action is what I now have to resort to, not what I wanted to do.
And Sarah, since we last spoke, in fact, since your accident happened, there have been other incidences like yours. Lives lost, falling onto a tube track. You mentioned in your speech there, which we didn't show on TV, an incident that happened at Barnet Tube Station just a few weeks ago. Somebody was hit by a bus at Victoria Bus Station. Over the weekend, somebody was pushed onto the tube tracks at Oxford Circus. What goes through your mind when you hear stories like that? Because they happen, once you look out for them, with alarming regularity.
Yes, and it feels like that it's underreported at the time, but if you look closely, you can see it. So I was tipped off that there was an incident on the 26th of December at the end of last year, where a gentleman fell onto the tracks at Stratford, which is also a terminus station, just like High Barnet. And this man got run over by 4 trains. And because it's an end station, that means 8 times. Of course, that gentleman didn't survive, but that prompted me to, be resolved in this and saying, like, we need to do something about this.
You're taking this on. I mean, you've got a lot to cope with already. As we said, you lost your arm and your leg in this, and you're still... You look great, but you're bearing the scars of that physically and emotionally. We've spoken about that. Again, since we spoke, when I travel on the Tube network, I'm standing at Westminster Station in front of glass barriers, and there are quite a lot of those at the modern tube stations, glass barriers between the passengers on the platform and the tube tracks. You think, why aren't these everywhere? And it's not like TfL haven't got any money. They're expected to make £79 million profit this financial year. When you look at TfL ULEZ fines, in revenue, they took £50 million in revenue last year. So TfL do have money to make safety improvements, but they don't seem to want to allocate it to this, is what your understanding is from your response from them. The answers are out there, right?
Yes, and what I find disappointing is there is emphasis on what I would call PR stunts and saying, oh, for Fashion Week, we'll change Bond Street into Burberry Street. That costs money, and I don't think it's necessary. I read an article about putting cardboard steering wheels on DLR trains because that could be fun for the passengers, but that's not what we care about. We care about trains being on time, carriages being tidy, clean, and being safe.
Being safe on a tube and when you're on the platform. I mean, something so simple. I mean, again, what struck me about your story is when you were saying that the driver of the tube train, one of the tube trains that hit you, couldn't see you because the light on the front of the tube train was so small, bigger lights on the front of tube trains, so they could see what's on the tracks in front of them. Simple measures like that.
And I think it's a different world, whether you work in a startup company or a corporate organisation or a public services or government-run entity. I feel that the speed of change or speed of innovation is very long.
Yeah.
All the solutions are out there.
And the London Mayor has refused to meet you so far. Sarah, I know you'll keep asking for a meeting with him because this is too serious to you and so many other families to let go. So thank you, Sarah. We'll speak again. Sarah de Lagarde, always a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you. Well, we do have a response from Transport for London. This is a spokesperson for the office of the Mayor of London, in fact, which says that the Mayor's thoughts remain with Sarah and her loved ones. He has asked to be kept updated and is very keen to meet Sarah once the claim is resolved. We'll follow up on that story, of course, here on the UK Tonight. Now, Sky News understands that the family of Brianna Ghey has been invited to meet the Prime Minister and the Technology Secretary to discuss online safety. It comes as the Prime Minister faces calls to apologise after he made a comment about Sir Keir Starmer's position on trans people at Prime Minister's questions. He took aim at the Labour leader for U-turning on the definition of a woman. Now, Brianna Ghey's mother, Esther, wasn't in the public gallery for the exchange, but entered shortly afterwards.
It's a bit rich, Mr. Speaker, to hear about promises from someone who's broken every single promise he was elected on. I mean, I think I counted almost 30 in the last year. Pensions, planning, peerages, public sector pay, tuition fees, childcare, second referendums, defining a woman.
Of all the weeks to say that, when Brianna's mother is in this chamber, shame.
Now, this evening, Brianna's father told Sky News as the PM for our country to come out with degrading comments like he did, regardless of them being in relation to discussions in Parliament. They are absolutely dehumanising. Identities of people shouldn't be used in that manner, and I personally feel shocked by his comments and feel he should apologise for his remarks. Now, Brianna Ghey has been writing and campaigning to change the perception of mental health in the media and in society for decades now. Her latest book, Mad Woman, is a reflection on her life now that she's in her 40s and what she's learned about mental illness and society. Brianna, welcome. We're slightly squeezed on time by the US Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, which I'm sure you'll understand, but I'm very keen to talk to you about Mad Woman, the follow-up to Mad Girl, because this is you many years on. You're now in your 40s, and the mental health battles you have and your perception of mental health, how it's sort of moved on since your first book.
Yeah, well, the first book I wrote about my experiences with OCD and eating disorders, and it was really a way of making sense of it. And it did very well, and it was a way of connecting with people, because I'd heard so many people say, you know, I'd heard so often that thing of 1 in 4 people experience a mental health issue each year, but I was like, I've never met them, I don't meet them.
Who are they?
It was a way of putting it out and going, if you have had this thing that I have, please come and talk to me, and we can like form a group. And so that sort of inadvertently led me into all of this mental health campaigning. And this book is really about, what the privilege I've had to learn. I learned so much about the kind of the world of mental health, but also about myself. Since I wrote Mad Girl, I've got sober. You know, this book is about my experiences with binge eating disorder, constantly learning stuff, but really...
And it goes through the lockdown with you, because so many people identify with that. Mental health in lockdown, just... There wasn't an outlet for people, there wasn't help for people. You know, it reared its head again for many people like yourself.
Well, it was a really, you know, and it also had a massive detrimental effect on mental health services. And I really do feel in the time I've been campaigning for better access to mental health services, we've really gone backwards since the pandemic. You know, it's very difficult to access mental health care. So I think there's that notion out there that we've got better at mental health because lots more people are talking about it. But I'm sure there are people watching this right now who, you know, for me, this was about, I realised I had this binge eating disorder at the age of 40, and I didn't even realise it was an eating disorder, you know, and I'm discovering all these new things about, you know, about myself, but also it's just, also that notion of realising that a lot of mental illness is really appropriate, Sarah. Like there's that notion that it comes out of nowhere. And I also had this thing that it was like, it's a chemical imbalance. But what I realised is a lot of mental health issues are very clever ways of your brain alerting you to the fact there is something wrong in the way you're living your life, or something wrong in your life.
There's a line in the book where you talk about becoming the poster girl for mental health, and one of your friends says, oh, would it be much more exciting to be a poster girl for one of the fashion houses? But you did find yourself the poster girl. I mean, you teamed up with the Royals to talk about mental health, you set up mental health mates, you ran marathons in your bra to raise awareness, and you went to interview Prince Harry as well. And, you know, what was that like? Because obviously he is very keen to talk about mental health matters, and you must have found yourself in a position thinking, how am I here? What was that like, that experience? Because, you know, for a royal to be so open,
Yeah, well, so he was. I was the first person he spoke to about his mental health stuff back in 2017, and I was shocked that he would speak to someone like me, who was such a kind of mess, or like who had openly been such a mess. But
we're all a mess in certain respects.
But that was why he chose to speak to me. And actually, this is the thing: when it comes to talking about mental health issues, it doesn't matter who you are.
Yeah.
Like Harry is, like when I speak to Harry, it's like speaking to you, or it's like speaking to any other person. These are issues that bring us all to the same level.
Mental health doesn't discriminate, does it? Bryony, it's a very frank and honest account of living with binge eating, OCD, and being sober as well. Mad Woman by Brianna Ghey is out now. Really good to talk to you. Thank you so much. We're back tomorrow night at 8. See you then.